Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Speech Collective podcast. My name is David Rosen. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Tiffany Hogan. Dr. Hogan is a nationally recognized researcher, professor, and advocate in the field of speech, language, and literacy. She serves as a director of the Speech and Language Literacy Lab at the MGH Institute of Health Professions and is also a research associate at the Harvard Medical School, where her groundbreaking work focuses on how children learn to read, why some struggle, and how we could best support them through evidence-based interventions. Beyond the lab, Dr. Hogan is also a passionate communicator and mentor, dedicated to bridging the gap between research and real-world practice. She's been featured in leading journals, collaborates with educators and clinicians across the country, and hosts her own podcast, SeeHearSpeak, where she makes complex research accessible to parents, teachers, and professionals. Her insights on language, learning differences, and the power of communication couldn't be more aligned with our mission here on the Speech Collective. I can't wait to dive into this conversation, Dr. Hogan. Welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here.
As we begin today's interview, it'd be helpful for my audience to understand your path into speech, pathology studies, and research. What motivated you to focus on speech, language, and literacy disorders, and how did you find yourself in your current position?
That's a great question. So I've always been interested in how children learn to talk. I loved children from a young age, and I was first interested in psychology. But ironically, when I first started out as a psychology major, I found out you had to get a PhD, and that wasn't of interest to me. So I moved actually to speech language pathology. And I was familiar with that field because my mother is a speech language pathologist as well. So I became a speech language pathologist and have always focused in the pediatric population. So I love working with children and watching them develop and supporting their development. When I started out as a clinician working in schools and a hospital, I had lots of unanswered questions. And so it led me to read a book by my mentor, Hugh Katz, on speech, language, and literacy development. And that led me to some conversations with him. And the next thing I know, I'm getting a PhD, which is pretty ironic because, again, originally I decided I have no desire in a PhD. But really what led me to this field as a researcher and as a clinical researcher is my interest in learning more about speech language development and how to support these children.
So I also read that you are a research assistant at Harvard Medical School. Can you expand on that? And what types of research do you do with Harvard?
Fantastic. Yes. So we have a complex system here in Boston. So Mass General Hospital, and I'm part of the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute for Health Professions, is the training ground for Harvard Medical School. So I have a dual appointment in MGH Institute of Health Professions and Harvard Medical School. The work I do there is really twofold. One, I study children as they develop longitudinally from very early on in toddlerhood all the way through to, adolescence. And we measure their speech, language, and literacy development and their cognitive skills over time, usually about once a year. And we have experimental tasks that we give to try to understand how speech and language and literacy are developing, what are the relationships between them. And then I work with schools in a different kind of parallel structure of my research. I work with schools to help them determine best ways to assess speech, language, and literacy and how to intervene and identify children who need support. So I have those two kinds of levers. I have the basic science approach and I have more of the applied science approach.
Okay, so now let's shift a little bit. So many people think of stuttering or speech sound errors as separate from reading issues. How are speech, language, and literacy actually connected?
Yes, they are much more connected than we, think they are. So language is in and of itself very complex. So language involves three primary components. There's form, which is the sounds of language and how we communicate with those sounds. If I was talking about sign language, the form would be the movements of my fingers and hands in space. But because we're talking about spoken language, it's the sounds. And we call that the form of language. We know children are developing that sound awareness and sound understanding and representation. They're developing that even in utero. So when I say they're developing it from birth, it's even before, because children, when they're born, can actually detect the voices they've heard in utero. So it's very exciting thinking about them developing from very early on these speech form, components of language. There's also the content of language or the meaning, and we think of that as vocabulary and grammar. And that's really carrying the meaning of what children and adults want to say. So what's behind the form? I'm trying to convey a meaning. And then there's also the pragmatics or social use of language. So all three of those are interconnected. So if a child has difficulty with sound representation, that's going to affect how well they can learn words and how well they can connect letters and sounds. If they have difficulties in pragmatics or social use of communication, that's going to impact how well they're able to talk through and convey the meaning of language. So it's all connected. And language also is the underpinning of reading comprehension, because when you read, you're connecting letters and sounds, and you're using your language ability to understand the language that's created by the text.
Okay, so for me, I didn't start speaking until the age of 3. And then at the age of 3, I just started speaking 3 languages at once. So what are the earliest indicators that a child might struggle with language literacy, and what should parents do to take action?
Great question. And your personal story is really informative too, because we know that one indicator of risk for language difficulty is being a late talker. And you would have qualified as a late talker, because late talkers are age 2 if they don't have 50 words or 2-word combinations. However, a key caveat, which you showcase, is that only about 25% of late talkers go on to have problems. 75% of them, go on and, we think of them as kind of, listening and learning and kind of storing up their language. And then they have that burst, like you said, you didn't have the speaking, but then you had this burst. And we see that for many late talkers. So what we say is that only 25% or so of late talkers turn out to have language difficulties, but most, if not all, children with language difficulties were late talkers. So late talking is definitely a risk factor. And if a parent is concerned that their child is not talking and communicating, and especially if it's affecting them socially, they're getting frustrated, they're trying to communicate their needs, or on the other hand, maybe they're receding from social interaction, they're sitting back and not engaging, then a parent should actually reach out to a pediatrician or a speech language pathologist, ideally, to say, I'm concerned, and at least have a consultation to learn more about what the child's doing, to see what are the risk factors and do they need support. And regardless, parents benefit from understanding how to stimulate their children's language. And a lot of that is just engaging them in conversation, listening to what they have to say, and also expanding on what they're saying. Using sign language is very helpful and does not impede spoken language. So using sign language is another way to get young children to engage.
So while your work often focuses on dyslexia and speech sound disorders, how do these challenges overlap or differ from stuttering, which is the speech impediment that I had?
Yes, so great question. So stuttering is quite unique in the sense that it involves the motor planning and the speech processing, and that can in fact have an impact on language and reading, but it's not 100%. So some people who have stuttering, they actually really prefer reading, because when they read in their head, sometimes they're not stuttering in their head when they're reading. So they might find solace in reading, and they may have no difficulties learning to read. However, some do have difficulties. So what we try to say is, think about a comprehensive evaluation where you're evaluating if a child has any type of speech and language issue. Then we need to evaluate the whole system to determine, is it isolated to that specific aspect of language, or is it something that's more broad? And we know if you have one difficulty with a language aspect, like stuttering, you have a higher likelihood of having other difficulties in other domains of language. So your likelihood is higher, but it's not guaranteed. So we always recommend a comprehensive evaluation if a child has any difficulty in any aspect of speech or language.
That is fascinating. Wow. So what is one common misconception about children with speech or reading difficulties that you wish more families and educators understood?
The biggest myth that I hear, and it's quite damaging, is that children with speech and language difficulties are unintelligent. And that is extremely frustrating. And it's based in the fact that intelligence is typically measured through verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence. And then those are averaged together to get a composite score. So children with speech and language difficulty will often score lower in that verbal intelligence aspect. And so because they're being evaluated on verbal intelligence, meaning it's measured by how well they can fluently produce speech or what vocabulary they have and what grammar, then it appears to outside the public that they might be unintelligent. However, that's really a damaging myth because there's multiple types of intelligence, not just verbal and nonverbal, but there's also emotional intelligence as well. And when we think about all the different intelligence that you have, yes, they may be lower in verbal intelligence, but there's a range of abilities in the other types of intelligence. Plus, I think that we have a very narrow view as a society of what intelligence is. We need to think about a child's strengths, not just focus on their weaknesses. So what I would like the public to know is that speech and language difficulty is a neurodiversity that's part of the human condition. It's a brain structure that makes it difficult to learn speech and language, but also has lots of other strengths. And I wish we would focus more on those strengths.
Is it true that kids with speech impediments are on average more intelligent than normal, or is that just a myth too?
That's really a myth. So the data that we find is that there's a range. So it's just like you would find in a child who doesn't have speech difficulty, there is a range of abilities in terms of intelligence.
So you've emphasized equity and speech and literacy intervention. What disparities worry you most, and what changes could schools or policymakers make right now to close those gaps?
Great question. So what we see consistently in the data nationwide is that there's these disparities based on race. And that's not really based on the child's race. What that's based on is a lot of the testing that we do is focused on one aspect of our culture. So we need to really think about testing. If that's going to be our standard to determine who's making benchmarks in education, we need to have tests that value all cultures. That's one possibility. We also need to create inclusive practices. So we don't focus just on books, for instance, with white characters. We need to focus on books that represent all the children in the U.S. and all the children sitting in the classroom. Children need to see themselves represented in the textbooks that they're using and in the history that we're reporting.
So for a parent listening today who feels worried but doesn't know where to start with their child, what's one thing they could do at home this week to support their child's speech and language growth?
This is a great question. And I would say that the biggest impact we can see is if you read to your child. So even just one book is so helpful because reading has lots of different benefits. It involves connecting over something together. So you're sharing. Oftentimes it can involve sitting close. So you have that closeness that's occurring too. So you're sharing an experience. Also, books provide vocabulary that you don't typically hear in everyday conversation and complex grammar as well. And I will say that if a parent feels uncomfortable reading, because many parents have their own reading difficulties, you can listen to a book. And there's many open access free resources like podcasts and also others through local libraries where you can actually listen to books together. So even just a very short time, 20 minutes a day of connecting and listening to books is very, very helpful. Parents also might be struggling and they're chasing resources, and that's a really tough thing. And they're doing lots of jobs, and there's housing insecurity and food insecurity. So it may seem like reading a book together or even listening together can be very difficult. But even if you listen to it apart and discussed it, it would be helpful. So maybe you don't have the time to sit together, but even just a few minutes together to talk about, a shared experience is so, so very helpful.
I've gone to a lot of speech language pathologists over my years through my journey of stuttering, and the majority of them did not make a tangible impact on my speech. So if every speech language pathologist could adapt just one practice from your research tomorrow, what should it be?
This is a really tough question because we have so many findings, and it's definitely one of my goals to think about how to enact those findings. And one of the ways we do this is we work together with speech language pathologists. I learn so much from hearing about what they're dealing with every single day in practice. So what I would say is what we find is taking an approach where you truly help the child and empower them to understand that they have a neurodiversity. This is something that's part of their brain. And I think as speech-language pathologists, we often think of remediation. But what I would like to think about is more about focusing on this is who you are. So how can you be the best version of who you are? And how can you find and create environments that support you? So instead of changing you to fit the environment, how do we empower children and adults to think about changing the environment to support them? And I know that's a tricky concept, but it is a shift. It's a shift from intervention only to actually thinking about compensation and support, not just intervention. So I don't know if that resonates with your personal experience, but it's something that seems to be resonating with the speech language pathologists that I'm working with.
So I've seen many fascinating research developments in the speech world. I've seen an AI-based program like Dr. Fluency's tablet system, personalized speech practice, and basically help me overcome my speech impediment. What's the most exciting research development that you've personally seen in speech and literacy science, and how might it impact kids in the next decade?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think AI has so much power. And what I hear you saying too is that you used it to think about how it could support you. So you did that. It was an agency that you had to make that happen. So I think the most exciting part is actually putting the agency into the hands of those who are living every day with speech and language difficulty, with parents who are supporting them. And I do think that AI is, people are kind of jumping on that bandwagon, but I think it's real that we can really think about how do we leverage AI to improve the supports we need and break down the many barriers that we encounter to getting evidence-based practice into the hands of parents, those who have communication difficulties, and in the speech language pathologists who are serving them.
So shifting to your podcast a little bit. So you host your SeeHearSpeak podcast. You've spoken with so many experts. So what's one insight from those conversations that really stood out to you and changed the way you think about speech and literacy?
Yeah, I've been pondering this question, and I have to say it's very difficult because every single conversation I have, I always walk away learning more. And as a scholar, I am a lifelong learner. So I think what struck me, and I had to think about it collectively. So I am going to say there's not one point, but collectively, what I have learned is that everyone has a different context. So what I think might work with my partners in Boston, interestingly, doesn't always translate to working with partners in Arizona, for instance, because we're all affected by the policies and the environment in which we are. And we often don't think about that. We think like, okay, I'm going to create this evidence-based practice and it can work everywhere. But what I've learned through implementation science and listening to all my guests is that we have to be, hold to evidence, but we also have to be flexible enough to adapt and to break down the barriers in each setting that we're at. So even if we have an intervention that's perfect in one setting, we have to think about how is it going to work in another setting? And it might be a little bit different depending on the state policies, depending on the district policies when we're working in schools. So I think my big take home from talking to all my podcast guests combined is that we have to consider how does our environment, our context in which we're treating children, how does that affect the evidence-based practice?
Dr. Hogan, thank you so much for answering all my questions. And thank you for joining me today. It's been a huge pleasure. And I hope our listeners found your insights as fascinating as I did. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for creating this podcast, and thank you for sharing your story.